And I really don't care at all about real punks whining about fake punks, but I care even less about fake punks whining about real punks whining about fake punks.
We are in a very strange time for music because on the one hand, more people than ever are making music. I think there's something like 100,000 songs uploaded to streaming platforms every single day. And personally, I think that's amazing. I love that so many people are making music, and that as a listener, my biggest problem is that I don't have time to listen to even a fraction of it. Like, that's a great problem to have, right? Because I remember back in high school saving up money and really carefully picking out which albums I was going to buy every month. And probably most of the time, half of them ended up being terrible, and I wasted all my money. So to me, having access to all this music really should be a dream come true for music fans, especially considering that it's all free. And yet when I go online, it seems like everybody just hates everything. Reviews complain about Autotune and mixing. Any breakthrough artist gets accused of being an industry plant. And in the event that people actually acknowledge that a song is good, well, even then they have to try to undercut it. They'll point out that there were 5 people with writing credits on the album and say that the artist doesn't deserve any credit because clearly the writers and producers did everything. I mean, for people who are supposedly music fans, they sure seem to hate a lot of music. And it turns out that there's actually a name for everything I talked about here. It's called Rockism, and at least for me, it's absolutely ruining any pleasure that I used to get from music. And so in this video, I'm going to explain what Rockism is and why, in my opinion, it needs to die. The term rockism was first coined back in 1981, and it essentially refers to the idea that good music has to look and sound like 4 guys playing raw, stripped down rock and roll in some kind of like greasy dive bar. Or to put a finer point on it, as an article by Khalifa Sena in 2004 said, rockism means idolizing the authentic old legend or underground hero while mocking the latest pop star, lionizing punk while barely tolerating disco, loving the live show and hating the music video.
What about Sabbath? AC/DC? Motorhead? Oh, what are they teaching this place?
And when I read that, you might be kind of nodding to yourself saying, I don't see a problem here. That sounds right to me. But personally, I'm not so sure that I'm on board with all that. And that is what I want to talk about in this video. And I think there are 2 main problems here. First, I think from a philosophy of art perspective, there's a lot of assumptions inherent to the rockist point of view that just don't hold up to scrutiny. And on a practical level, I think the influence of rockism on the way that people talk about music and the culture of fandoms is absolutely toxic. I think it's the reason why the overall tone of any kind of discussion around music is so negative. But to explain what I mean, let's get into some specifics. At the most basic level, rockism is exactly what it sounds like. It's the belief that rock as a genre is the center of the musical universe. As Douglas Wolk said, expanding on the New York Times piece that I mentioned earlier, rockism is treating rock as normative. In the rockist view, rock is the standard state of popular music, the kind to which everything else is compared explicitly or implicitly. So, for instance, it's a rockist opinion that pre-stereo era blues and country are interesting less in their own right than because they anticipated rock, or that Run DMC and Alison Krauss are notable because their virtues are also the virtues of rock, or that Sierra's Goodies isn't interesting because it fails to act like rock. And that is a whole lot of words to basically say that rockists only care about music if it validates the very specific, narrow range of music, which they define as important and authentic. Everything outside of that is ignored or rejected. As one example of that, Post Malone. He came out in 2016 and became one of the biggest names in hip-hop almost overnight, with his first 2 albums, which were both smash hits on a commercial level, but also, at least in my opinion, some of the best mainstream music to come out in like a decade. Both absolutely incredible.
You know I said it, I am better now, better now. I only say that 'cause you're not around, not around.
But despite all of that, rock fans wouldn't give him the time of day because, again, they don't care about anything outside of rock. Until a couple years ago when it came out that actually he's a big fan of bands like Pantera, Megadeth, and Power Trip, and he did a live stream of Nirvana covers.
As you are, as you were, as I want you to be.
And then suddenly everyone decided that actually Post Malone was cool and his music was actually pretty good. They wouldn't acknowledge the validity of his music until he kissed the ring of what they believed to be quote unquote real music. In other words, old rock bands. Or as another example, back in the 2000s, Sum 41. The same people who hated Blink-182, Good Charlotte, and New Found Glory would give Sum 41 at least a little bit of credit because they name dropped Iron Maiden and Judas Priest in Fat Lip. The point here is that in this rockist paradigm, artists are only seen as interesting or valid if they pay tribute to or somehow have some sort of tie to the classics of the rock canon. Like how metal fans who generally hate rap seem to sort of accept Public Enemy because they did a song with Anthrax 35 years ago. Now, just to be clear, I think it's totally okay if you love the classics and you appreciate it when artists pay tribute to them. There is absolutely nothing wrong with that. But when the rockist mentality requires them to pay tribute to rock artists of the past, that is a problem. Because in the words, again, of Douglas Wolk, quote, "It chains both artists and their audience to an ideal rooted in a particular moment of the past." And the reason why that's a problem should be obvious. Almost all the musical movements that we now love were radical departures from what came before them. Punk, nu metal, hip hop, the list goes on and on and on. All of them made a huge break from the past and in some cases even consciously rejected it, and that is exactly why they were great. And so if we have this mindset where we only accept something if it's very clearly tied to the past, well, then we're not going to get any of those new movements. And personally, I think that would be tragic if you care about the development of art. And let's talk about another example of how, in my opinion, rockism stifles innovation. Back in 2022, Falling in Reverse had to cancel a show when some of their laptops got lost. And for anybody who may not be familiar and they're wondering why losing a laptop is such a big deal, these days, just like with most bands, those laptops pretty much run their entire show. They sync the video and lights together, and they also control the playback of any backing tracks used in the music that, for whatever reason, can't really be reproduced live by a regular band. For example, the synths in the breakdown of Watch the World Burn. And this ended up creating a huge controversy kicked off by Eddie Trunk, formerly of That Metal Show on VH1, who said, "How much longer are fans, promoters, media just going to accept the epidemic of live rock shows not really being live? Paying your hard-earned money to see a band play live that's not truly live?" And to me, this is pure rockism, because at the core of rockism is the idea that authenticity is at the core of everything, and that perhaps the very most important thing in all of music is the live show. And specifically, if it's not 4 or 5 guys standing on stage playing every single note that you hear, that somehow that's not authentic. And that might sound okay at first, but let's think about this for a minute. Take a band like Avenged Sevenfold, who might very easily have 6 or 8 tracks of guitars at certain places in some of their songs. What are they supposed to do about that when it's time to play a show? Do you want them to sound worse live by just leaving all of that out because they can't have 8 guitarists on stage? Or would you rather they just use some backing tracks to make it sound like it does on the album? But it's more than just that. This sort of hatred of backing tracks really limits artists, because if we don't want people to use backing tracks live, well, that means they can't use any electronics or any orchestral elements or anything else other than like 2 guitar tracks, because those can't be reproduced live without bringing a huge crew on the road, which for most bands is just not financially viable. And this is one of the biggest problems with rockism. It actively holds back innovation by restricting the definition of valid art to basically, if it doesn't look and sound like something from 1976, it's trash. And is that the world that we want to live in? I don't think so. I think that we should want artists to experiment with all kinds of new ideas and use whatever technology they want to bring those ideas to life. And as far as the live show goes, I don't really understand this obsession and hatred for backing tracks. Like, if you're having a good time at the show, why does it matter if they use a few tracks? The legendary critic Robert Christgau actually had a great quote about this. "To be a rockist was to demand a perception of honesty in pop music, no matter how much artifice that honesty involved. And when you're standing on a stage, playing an instrument and singing words you've memorized, there's no getting around artifice." And he's he's totally right, because if you think about it, there's really nothing about a live show that is quote unquote authentic. It's an entirely contrived performance. Like there's a light show that's very carefully designed to set a certain mood at exactly the right time and the right song to make you feel something. Every detail of the show is rehearsed to be perfect. Everyone stands in a certain place with very carefully marked off boundaries. And there's a whole crew of stagehands and other production people on deck to make sure that everything goes off without a hitch and that every guitar is perfectly in tune. And a lot of the same people who would complain about backing tracks would also be the same people to complain if one of the guitars wasn't perfectly in tune. And so my question is, with all of that in mind, why is it suddenly off limits to use backing tracks? I'm really not sure that that makes a lot of sense. To me, it just kind of feels like people are looking for something to be upset about. And speaking of which, I have a feeling that this is not going to be a very popular thing to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. I want to question one of Rockism's core values, which is the emphasis on the live show itself. Like you've heard people say a million times, like, oh yeah, that band's pretty cool, but can they pull it off live? And the unstated assumption here is that live shows are the standard by which everyone should be compared to, rather than studio performances. And my question is, why would that be true? Why is the live show inherently more valid than a studio performance? To me, I think this is just another purity test for gatekeepers to use. And what I mean by that is that it's always going to be the case that of all the people who know of any given artist, a relatively small portion of them will ever see that artist live. That's just how it works, right? Like even somebody like Metallica that plays to stadiums full of 50,000 people every night, that's actually a pretty small fraction of the probably, billion or so people on the planet who are familiar with their music. And so I think by emphasizing the live show, it's really just another way of sort of making people feel like they aren't real fans and invalidating their opinions by drawing on this supposed insider knowledge. Like, oh, you like that band? Yeah, well, they're terrible live. The implication there being that you're a fool because you like the studio version of this song.
She said that you walked away, try not to lose you.
And aside from that, just from a purely creative standpoint, I personally prefer studio recordings to live performances. Mostly because I think the possibilities are just so much more open. Like think if bands like Nine Inch Nails, Radiohead, or again, Avenged Sevenfold limited themselves to the mindset of, we can only do this if we can play it live without backing tracks. If they thought that way, we would have a whole lot less interesting music in the world. Which brings me to another issue I have with Rockism, this obsession with finding fault in anything and everything. For example, that people seem to love to always talk about how some artist is flopping or underperforming. It's a really consistently popular topic on Reddit and Twitter and other places where these rockist types tend to congregate. Anytime a new album comes out by an established artist, unless it's literally #1 on Billboard, the conversation is immediately about how it's flopping. And to some extent, I get it. Like I do think it's interesting to see how well an album is performing on a commercial level, partly because I've spent my whole career in marketing where I'm responsible for paying attention to that kind of thing. But I don't think it's that. I don't think it's just people who have this casual interest in observing the performance of an album. It feels more like people want the album to flop so that they can make a thread shitting on it. And they do the same thing with production too. It seems like it's almost the default to complain about the mix on any new album.
Like, oh, I really wanted to like that album, but the mix ruined it. Everything is so compressed.
It almost feels like this contest where everybody is trying to outdo each other and who can be more critical and find fault in like literally anything and everything. It's almost like the more critical you are, the more valid your opinions are. Like on this Reddit thread about albums ruined by bad production, one of the commenters brings up Rick Rubin as an example. And obviously it's totally okay if you're not a fan of everything he's done, but like really now we're saying that Rick Rubin sucks? That's what level of just like negative assholes we've become? That one of the greatest producers of all time, even he sucks? Honestly, I think it's sad. And I think that this is because for a lot of these rockist types, their entire identity is about being the guy with quote unquote good taste in music. And they think that the best way to show people that you have good taste is by criticizing every little detail about stuff that other people like.
You guys are snob.
No, we're not.
No, seriously, you're totally elitist. You feel like the unappreciated scholars, so you shit on the people who know less than you. No, which is everybody.
Yes.
And first of all, I can tell you from firsthand personal experience, unfortunately, that being that guy doesn't make people think that you're cool or smart. It makes people think that you're an insufferable asshole. And aside from that, it really just sort of turns the whole culture of music fandom into, at least in my opinion, a miserable experience. Although, to be fair, it's not just music, it's also movies and gaming and just about everything else. It seems like everybody just wants to tear everything down, and honestly, I find it incredibly exhausting. And I can't imagine what it's like to be a musician or a game developer or filmmaker now, knowing that literally no matter what you do, people on social media are going to nitpick and find fault with every little detail of anything that you make, and gloat over every mistake you make, and root for your project to fail so that they can make a thread about it and get upvoted. And again, is that really the world that we want to live in? Do we want artists to spend so much of their energy on just dealing with all the negative shit that people say about them? And so given that they exist in this environment, it's no wonder when you see celebrities have meltdowns, or when you see something like Lizzo's recent statement where she basically said, "You guys are assholes, fuck this, I quit." And honestly, I don't blame her one bit. I completely agree with everything she said.
I hate you guys. You guys are assholes.
Another trope of rockism that I really dislike and disagree with is their disdain for artists who use outside songwriters or producers. For example, when MGK's album Tickets to My Downfall came out, one of the main narratives was, oh, look at the credits, look how many people worked on this, and therefore somehow that it's not valid art. You saw a lot of comments along the lines of this one. You could take any middling artist and put them in that same situation with the people who made that album, Neil Avron, Travis Barker, the other 15 songwriters, etc., and you'd get basically the same result. And put aside whether you like MGK's music or not, because that's not actually the point here, and think about the underlying assumption that these people are making. They're saying that the artist isn't important, that only the producers and songwriters are, which first of all we know is objectively untrue, because Travis Barker's produced probably a dozen other albums and EPs that weren't nearly as successful as Tickets to My Downfall. But aside from that, there's a larger question again on sort of a philosophy of art level, which is, why is it bad to get help from producers and songwriters? What exactly is wrong with collaboration? To me, this is like telling an Olympic medalist that they're not a real athlete because they have coaches, and then actually all the credit for that win goes to their coaches. Like, everything has to be the product of this one lone genius, or somehow it's not valid. And why don't we apply the same logic to other art forms? Think about films. They're a collaboration between the actors, the writers, the production crew, the directors, and so forth. But nobody questions the validity of that arrangement, because we all know that a movie is a big project and it takes a big team to put that together. And my question is, why would music be any different? If a band gets help from a producer on fine-tuning some specific part of a song, or if they get a co-writer to help them tweak some of the lyrics to make them a little bit better and catchier, well, isn't that a good thing? Shouldn't we want artists of all kinds to collaborate and help each other make the absolute best work they can? I would think so. So anyway, I could keep going, but what it comes down to is this. I'm tired. I'm exhausted by all the negativity in almost every discussion about music, because it seems like all people want to do is tear down what artists are doing and attack the opinions of other fans. So please, let's just give it a break. Let rockism die of old age like it should have a long time ago. All right, my friends, that does it for this video. As always, let me know what you think in the comments. And also, I would like to thank everyone who supports me on Patreon, especially those of you who support at the True Cult level or above. Patrons get all my videos early. I do giveaways and Q&As sometimes, and there's a way to have me review your music. So if any of that sounds cool, hit the link in the description of this video. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, but I will see you next time.